Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and this is another video to help you improve your chess game. I thought we'd do another 20-minute exercise. We haven't done one for quite a while. So let me remind people who haven't seen my prior videos on 20-minute exercise what we're doing here. So there's a lot of people that play fairly quick games. They play 10-minute games, they play 15-minute games. They think speed chess is 2-minute games and slow chess is 15-minute games. And then they wonder why they're kind of stuck at ratings, because one of the reasons, not the only reason, is that they never learn how to think. They really don't learn how to find better moves. They don't learn how to take their time. If you ever threw them into a real chess tournament where you have a minimum of 30 minutes for a game and probably a lot longer, they would be lost as to what they need to think about. So I tell people, well, what you could do is you could do a 20-minute exercise, which is take a random position, hopefully one with a little bit of meat on it, and force yourself to think for 20 minutes and see what's the best move you can find in 20 minutes. So that's what I've done a few times in the videos, but I haven't done it for a while, so I thought I would do one today. I'm going to pick a random game from the recent US Championship, and we'll try to pick a random position. If the position's like a recapture, we might go to the next move. But then I'm going to force myself to think for 20 minutes and see what I can find in the position. Sometimes I can't find much after 7 or 8, and I have to kind of tap dance the last 12, but usually I can spend most of the 20 if I have to. Now, in a normal game, the average move is only 3 or 4 minutes, so I'm going to be doing a lot more than what we'd normally do in a game, but that's the point. The point is, we want to see how much you can see, practice your visualization, practice your evaluation, all those skills you need to become a better chess player. All right, so let's pick a random game. Let's see, today is the 27th of the month. So let's see what game number 27 is. Examine. We got to bring up my Examine US Champ 21% 27. All right, we've got Zhang against Shanklin. Okay, let me center the board here so you can see it on the video. All right, let's bring that up. Going to make the board a little smaller. Okay, we're getting there. All right, so we've centered the board. All right, so now we need a move and a color. So Zhang is white, Shanklin is black. I don't know. Let's take the position after white's 24th move. So we want to go forward 46th ply. All right, black has just played queen to f6, and it's white's move. All right, so 20 minutes, we're about 3 minutes into the video, so we want to go for 23 to 20 minutes, and then we'll see what the grandmaster's played, we'll see what the computer says, and we'll call it a day. All right, so black has just played queen f6. So when we're looking at a position cold, what do we need to do? Well, we need to count the material. 2 knights, a bishop, 2 rooks, and a queen. 2 knights, a bishop, 2 rooks, and a queen. 6 pawns, materials even. Okay, so we have an unbalanced position here. There's a lot of tension between d4 and e5, those pawns. Black has a 4-on-3 majority on the king's side, which he would get if he had played e4. White has a 2-on-1 majority on the queen's side, well, 3-on-2, but the d pawns are blocked. So basically, if we look to the left of the d file, we see a c and a b pawn for white that can become a passed pawn by pushing c6. And we see black having 4 pawns to 3 on the right side of the d pawns. Okay, so black's move is queen f6. Well, what are all the things that move does? Well, it attacks d4. d4, according to our safety table, is attacked twice, only guarded once. So black's theoretically threatening to just win a pawn by playing e takes d4. That would double and isolate his pawns. Maybe if he won that pawn, then white could not hold on to it. On the other hand, suppose black plays e4 on the next move. Then where would that knight go? The knight can't go to g1. There's a king there. He can't go to e1. There's a rook there. He can't go to d2. There is a knight there. He can't go to d4. There's a pawn there. If he goes to e5, then black's just winning a pawn. e4, knight e5, one of the knights takes on e5, d takes e5, and then black takes back, probably with a pawn. Sorry, probably with a knight. Knight takes e5. So we're looking at the no move hypothesis. We're trying to figure out if e4 is a threat. So e4, knight e5, knight takes e5, d takes e5, knight takes e5. Black wins a pawn, and black's completely winning the game. E4, knight g5 is not possible. E4, knight h4 is not possible. So that tells us what white needs to do. At the very least, white needs to stop e4, which wins a pawn. So let's ask a different question now. What are all the ways white can not lose a knight by letting black, or sorry, not lose a pawn by letting black play e4? He could counterattack with c6, but that doesn't look very promising. Black's got c6 guarded 3 times, and white's only got it guarded twice, so counterattacking with c6 doesn't seem reasonable. He could play rook a7 and hit the b pawn, but I would think black might even sack the b pawn. Let's see, rook a7, e4, knight e5, knight takes e5, d takes e5, knight takes e5, rook takes b7, and then maybe bishop c8, and I like black's central majority a lot better than I like white's connected pass pawns, but it is interesting. And of course, black doesn't have to give white that pawn. Black could just guard the pawn first by playing rook to b8 or bishop to c8 or something like that. So he could do that. Let's show you what I was looking at. So people are always saying to me, Dan, why don't you move the pieces when you're doing this? Well, if you're doing a 20-minute exercise, you can't move the pieces, because if you move the pieces, then you're not practicing your visualization, and that's one of the skills that we want you to get better. So, but I'm going to move the pieces here just to show you the line I was looking at. So I said rook a7, and I said, suppose black doesn't save the pawn. He certainly can, but suppose he goes after the knight. Well, I guess white doesn't have to play knight e5, which I said. He could play rook takes b7 and hit the bishop, but then the bishop will go back and hit the rook. And then he's hitting a rook and a knight, and that looks like it's winning material for black. So let's look at knight e5. This is what I was looking at before. Knight takes, pawn takes, knight takes, rook takes. And I think these two pawns on the D and E file are, even though they're not as advanced, are controlling the center part of the board. And I think black is doing quite well here. Even though white's connected pass pawns are very dangerous. This is an unbalanced position where both sides can win, but I don't think black would be too worried about this. So what does that tell me? Well, it tells me that rook a7 is a candidate move, but it's probably not the move that Grandmaster Zhang played. All right, so what else could he play? So we're thinking that black has two threats. He could threaten e takes d4 and e4. So we kind of have to look at both of those, and that would tend to make us think that white should take on e5. And that would not only solve both problems, but it would isolate the d pawn. Now, it would unlock black's pieces. We see that black's got all his pieces bunched in a little area, and as soon as you take on e5, they come exploding out at you. So that's what Shanklin wants, of course. He wants more activity for his army, and he's willing to take that isolated pawn. But that will solve Zhang's problem of what to do if this central black mass is coming down at him. So let's take a look at capturing on e5. I don't think it makes a big difference which way you capture, because black's going to capture back. So I guess it's possible that if black captures back with a knight, if you play e takes d4, knight takes d4, either one, then white doesn't have to capture the knight. He could play knight d4 and blockade the isolated pawn. The knight on d4 is not held, so black could have a discovery by moving the knight on e5. So for instance, e takes d5, knight on 7 takes e5, knight to d4, and then black could play knight on e5 somewhere, I'm not sure where, and attack the knight. Knight f3 check doesn't work because either knight could take on f3 and that would win a piece. And the other knight moves I don't think are that dangerous. Knight g4. White, if worst comes to worst, could then play knight on 2 to f3 to guard the knight. So e takes d4, knight on 7 to e5, knight d4, knight g4, knight on 2 to f3. now black can't play queen h4 because the knight on f3 is guarding h4. So I think white's okay. So therefore, taking with the pawn seems to be a little bit more flexible than taking with the knight. If you take with the knight and he takes, if knight takes c5, knight takes c5, d takes c5, let's say knight takes e5, then you have to move your knight on d2 to get to d4 in a couple moves. But if you take with the pawn first and he takes with the knight, you can always take back with the knight anyway and transpose. So when I see ideas like this, I call this move domination. And that is that since e takes d4, knight takes d4, knight takes d4, something takes back on d4, gives white the option, if he plays e takes d4, knight takes d4, to also play knight d4. While if you play knight takes e5 first, at the best you can do is transpose into that one line with d takes e5. So what I'm proving here is that d takes e5 is at least as good, if not better, than knight takes e5. So we could eliminate knight takes e5 as a candidate move, because I don't see that it does anything different. Now, if Grandmaster Zhang decides that he's going to take twice no matter what, and that e takes d5 is going to just transpose, and he's going to trade off his knight on f3, then Grandmaster Zhang could play knight takes e5, because it's equal. In that case, he's determining that it's equally good with e takes d5, and he doesn't care about the move order, and he could play knight takes e5. What I'm saying is that that's the worst that knight takes e5, or that's the best that knight takes e5 can be, is as good as e takes d5. So if I'm playing here, I would probably, even if I thought they were equal, I would probably play e takes d5 and maintain my options of not trading off the knights. Alright, so e takes d5 right now becomes my king of the hill. My king of the hill is the move that I would play right now if I had to move. For instance, suppose I was playing in a simultaneous exhibition and Grandmaster Shanklin was walking around the room going to board, and the rule in simultaneous exhibitions is when he gets to your board, then you have to move. Well, if Grandmaster Shanklin came to my board right now, I would play e takes d4, and then if he played one of the knights takes on e5, then I would not move right away, which is called blitzing in simuls. I would not move right away. I would wait, and then I would calculate whether I want to trade the knights or not. So that's what I would do at this point. And we're about almost 10 minutes in for our Think Out Loud 20-minute exercise. So I'm getting to the point where d takes e5 is my king of the hill. All right, let's look at other ideas. So we looked at counterattacking with rook a7, which is not ridiculous. It's probably not the right move. I'm now looking at a little bit of the fact that the bishop on f1 is kind of stuck guarding the pawn on b5, but I don't think that's much of an issue. The bishop on f1, a lot of my students would hate to put their bishop back on f1, and they'd say, oh, well, I've undeveloped my bishop on f1 and I've wasted 2 tempos by bringing it out and bringing it back. But actually, bishops are really fast pieces. They can move all the way across the board in one move. And once you've castled and once you've gotten your rook in the middle, like on e1 like this, then putting the bishop back on f1 is not the same kind of problem that maybe tucking a slow piece like a knight back there would be. If you move your knights backward, then they need to come back up to get back in the game. But you can move rooks and bishops and queens backward, and they can be just as much in the game as they were when they were further up the board. Not always, of course, but they can be. All right, so the bishop on f1 looks like it's a little bit passive at the moment, but there's no real place to go, so its only function is really right now guarding the king's side against, black coming down on the king's side, or guarding that pawn on b5. All right, so what else could white do? We need moves that save the knight. And the problem is moves that save the knight don't necessarily save the d4 pawn. Now, if we want to give him the d4 pawn, we could just make a silly move like king h1, and if he plays e4, play knight g1, or h3, which I think sets up a little bit of a target on the king side. Since black's better on the king side and both sides are castle king side, that's the kind of position where we don't really want to move the pawns in front of our king that much unless we need to. And here, h3, then if he plays e4, we have knight h2, where are we going from h2? We can't go back to g4. We can't go back to f3. It just doesn't make any sense. If we could move the knight on d2 to give d2 square. Well, that move actually makes some sense. White could play knight to b3, guarding the d4 pawn a second time, potentially guarding c5 if black takes on d4, and giving the other knight a place to move, so that if knight b3, e4, we can play knight on f to d2 and save the knight. And then the knight on b3 is guarding the pawn on d4. So this makes knight to b3 a candidate move. The problem is we're just letting black push the pawns right down the board when we do that. So, for instance, knight b3, e4, knight on f to d2, black could even think about playing f4 in that position to open up his bishop and increase the scope of his rook and his queen on the f file, and maybe even threaten f3. And it looks like black is making good progress, and I'm on the path to losing. So let's show that line. Knight b3, and the idea is if he takes here, we can always take back. And the idea is if he pushes here, we have a place for our knight to go. And now the other knight is guarding this pawn. But, you know, black can just play a move like here, and I can't undermine his pawn chain because I have no pawns that can play break moves against his d5 pawn, which means his e4 pawn is really rock solid, and if I play f3, I give him a protected passed pawn and lots of space on the king side. And this bishop is now pointing down toward my king. The knight can come down and help. With the knight off of the f3 square, the queen can come over there. This looks like a recipe for getting checkmated in another, 15 moves or so. White's queenside majority is not nearly as powerful as black's kingside majority now. And, black has a majority where I have my king and I can't get my king anywhere else. So I have a feeling this line is really, really bad for black. I've been wrong before, but let's go back to the game. So even though knight b3 doesn't immediately lose anything, and it meets the threat, I don't think Grandmaster Zhang played knight b3. I think even rook a7 is better than knight b3, but I don't really believe in knight rook a7 either. I'm pretty much down to d takes e5 as my number one move. Knight takes e5 as being equivalent, but maybe not quite as flexible. What else could I do? Can I counterattack f5? No. Can I... What else can white do? c6 we already said doesn't look that good. I guess I could play c6, b takes c6, rook a6, pinning the pawn to the queen. That doesn't look right. I mean, black could just play rook c8, black can play e4. Those counterattacks on the queen side, they're tricky, and I might be able to do something with them. But I really just like, let's spend some time now looking at my king of the hill. Let's look a little deeper. D takes e4, knight, one of the knights takes. Let's say the knight on f7 takes. It doesn't have to be the knight on f7, but, we don't have to perfectly determine which knight our opponent's going to take with. We just have to make sure that we can do something. So d takes e5, knight on 7 takes e5. I could play knight d4. Knight d4 is not forced. I could play then rook to a7. All right, so I could take on e5 first and then play something like rook a7. So let's calculate that a little bit. Is my rook on e1 guarded? All right, so let's take a look. D takes e5, knight takes e5, rook a7, knight takes f3 check. I can't take back with a g-pawn because my rook on e1 is not guarded, but I can take with my knight, and that would guard my rook. So knight takes f3, knight takes f3, rook takes e1, knight takes e1. So we're looking at the line d takes e5, knight on 7 takes e5, rook a7, knight takes f3 check, knight takes f3, rook takes e1, knight takes e1, and then black would, I don't know, he could attack my knight on e1 with his queen, put the queen on the e file, he could play the rook to the e file, he could guard the pawn on b7 with a move like bishop c8, or knight, well, he doesn't have knight to d8 anymore, the knight on f7 is the one that took back on e5. Alright, so I could trade rooks first and then play rook a7, but that brings his rook to the e-file and leaves my e-file a little weak, although not ridiculous. So I'm looking at d takes e5, knight on 7 takes e5. Well, it doesn't matter. I can't trade the rooks until he trades the knights. So could I play something else there? Could I trade off on e5 first and then play rook a7? I could. I guess I could. So d takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5. Now rook a7. Now he doesn't have knight f3 check because I have knight takes f3, winning a piece and guarding my rook. So d takes e5, knight on 7 takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, rook a7. Interesting. Can he play knight to d3 or something and hit my rook? I don't think so. He's not really threatening anything. He could play knight c6, and if I play b takes c6, he can play rook takes e1. I don't think that's a problem. I mean, I wouldn't do... If he plays knight c6, I think I could just play rook takes e8, knight takes a7. What am I looking at now? Just for those of you that don't see. Takes, 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 rook here, knight here. That's what I'm looking at. I'm visualizing that line. If I take his knight, he could take my rook, but then I could take his bishop. So maybe b takes c6, rook takes e1, c takes d7 is winning. I just have to make sure I don't get mated. All right, so back to the game. These are a little bit what I call flights of fancy, because they're probably not going to happen. I'm just kind of looking at what the possibilities are in the position. All right, we have about 1 minute left. I've decided that knight takes e5 and d takes e5 are probably the best moves. D takes e5 is more flexible. That's the move that I would play. What else could I learn in the last minute? After d takes e5, knight on 7 takes e5, I don't have to play rook a7. I don't have to play knight d4. I could just, improve the position of my pieces. Let's see, besides knight d4, what would do that? I can't move the knight on d2 because knight takes f3 check. Messes up my pawns on the king's side, and that would be terrible. I could trade on e5. I could play knight d4. I can play rook e7, a7. We just looked at that. I might even be able to play a strange move like rook to a4 to move the rook along the 4th rank where it's very open. I could do lots of things. I think white's standing okay. That black deep pawn on d5 could be a detriment to black in the endgame. So I think even though black's pieces are gaining in energy when I play d takes c5, I think the game is maybe slightly better for white. All right, we're using up your time. Let's see what happened in the game, and then we'll ask the computer what the top 3 moves are. He did play my move, d takes e5. Wow, that makes me feel better. How much time did he take? Almost no time at all. The relay time actually went up. He did take knight 7. Now let's see what he did. I was looking at moves like knight takes e5 or knight d4 or rook a7. He plays queen a4. Interesting, putting the queen on the same line with the bishop. Usually you don't do stuff like that. But it does put the queen across the 4th rank where it has a lot of scope, as I said. Knight takes. All right, so we don't have to take with the knight, but of course we will. Rook e4 hitting the queen, hoping that if he takes back he can put his pawns back together. I don't think white will take that. Now he puts the queen on a7. Black guards that. White's pawn. Now he's going after that weak d pawn. The knight comes up. Now black's looking at patterns like getting the queen over here with maybe knight h3 check and knight takes f2 check. Famous patterns. Rook goes behind the potential passed pawn. Black says, I'm going to overprotect my b pawn. White hits the knight with the queen. That stops queen to g6 because the queen takes f4. So he guards it with the pawn. Unbalanced position. We expect this probably won't be a draw. White says, now I get my passed pawn. He takes with the rook, making the passed pawn on the b file. Black hits the queen with a discovery. Says, if you take my queen, I'll take your queen. White says, okay. And he blockades the pawn, and again, still has the better endgame. Black awkwardly kind of puts the rook up to e5 to try to save the pieces. White says, all right, I'll keep attacking that isolated pawn, and I'll hit your bishop. I'll push my pawn. Pushes the knight away. Bishop hits that pawn on d5. Now black's getting into big trouble. And black resigned. Okay, very nice game from Grandmaster Zhang. This final position looks familiar. I turned it on when I was watching the U.S. Championship. I probably turned on the final positions from the games. And I said, oh, interesting, why is black resigning? And the answer is, well, this pawn is attacked twice and it's guarded 0 times. And there's really no defense against bishop takes d5 check. All right, so let's go back to the position from the DAT scan. From the 20-minute exercise. And we'll find the top 4 moves. Okay, Mr. Stockfish 14, show me your top 3 moves. All right, so Stockfish is saying d takes and knight takes are equivalent, which is pretty much what I said. And I would play d takes is slightly more flexible. That's what Zhang played. Stockfish says doesn't really matter. He's got them both almost identical. And he says that move rook a7, which we looked at extensively, is also good for white, and that's +2. So he basically says that white's already winning, and the best way to win is to trade on e5. And if you want to play rook a7, you're probably still winning. And if he plays e4, you could play rook takes b7. And play like we sort of said in the analysis. And that actually is good for white. I didn't trust my analysis of rook a7 as much. So I would give myself a high score on this 20-minute exercise. If you watch my other 20-minute exercises, I don't always do quite this well. But today I did a pretty good job. Okay, so you can do this too. You can do this at home. If you're one of those people who plays a lot of 15-minute games, you'll find doing a 20-minute exercise maybe once a month or so, once a week even, to be very helpful for learning how to visualize, how to analyze, how to evaluate. If you like today's video, hit a like. If you want to subscribe, you can do that. But the best thing you can do is tell other people about my channel, Dan Heisman Chess. And you can follow me on our Chess Tip of the Day on Twitter, at Dan Heisman. I've been doing Chess Tips of the Day for about 12 years, which means we've done, almost 4,000 chess tips of the day. Well, if I did one exactly every day, it would be over 4,000, but I probably missed a couple days. So I have about 4,000 chess tips of the day. All right, thanks for watching the video. We'll see you next time. Bye.